Hello, welcome to this week's podcast. And I wanted to share with you um, a situation that happened to me over the weekend with my teenage son. And in the hope that it just helps you deal with your teenagers or toddlers, it doesn't really matter what age the child is, um, to just maybe deal with things a bit more effectively. So it is not my intention here to tell you how to parent. That is not what I'm here to do. It's none of my business how you choose to parent your children. Um, but I do find it absolutely fascinating how, when we're dealing with children, we can become the child ourselves. And then the conversation is just very ineffective and it ends up to be a bit of a screaming match. So I've got two boys, um, 13 and 14, just about to turn 15 and then turning 14 in the summer. And my youngest, especially, is starting to push the boundaries of what's acceptable. Completely normal. Testosterone is starting to kick in. Sorry, as I started this podcast, my nose instantly starts itching. I do apologize about that. Um, but he's starting to push the boundaries. So this is a completely normal process for children to go through. Okay, they're learning. They did not come out of our womb knowing how to behave. It's my opinion that it's my job as a parent to teach them how I expect them to behave. And obviously, everybody's expectation is going to be very different. One of the things that I expect from my children is respect. I expect a certain level of respect. I also believe that I don't get that respect by shouting, by threatening, by fear. I don't want to force respect from fear. I want to force respect from love. And my youngest, especially, is very quick witted, very clever, is able to see a solution very quickly. My brain doesn't work like that. I'm more of a processor. Um, I will go away from something, process it. I'll always come up with a solution, but it's not necessarily in that second, whereas his is. And I'm very aware of this. So I have to come up with kind of solutions ahead of time should I need to enforce a consequence. And there have been a couple of situations recently where he's kind of pushed the boundary a little bit. And so one example is we were in the supermarket and I said they could go and get something from the like bakery section, a savory item from the bakery section. So they went off, chose something. And then my son also wanted a big bag grab of crisps, the big huge. And I was like, no, that's you don't need that as well. That's not acceptable. And so he argued, as they do, like complain. It wasn't shouting. I was like, no, Blue, you don't need to eat all of that. It's not acceptable. And then when we got to the till, he had sneaked it back into the basket. And so we're at the checkout, and he had ignored what I had said and put it into the checkout. And in that moment, I couldn't, because my brain is slightly slow at processing, I couldn't come up with a response on how to deal with that. Now, on hindsight, I would have just got, actually, next time, if that ever happens again, it'd be like, right, now you're not having anything. I said no, you can take everything back. Um, Very calmly, very controlled. Um, and so little things like this have been happening. And then on the weekend, gorgeous weather here in the UK. Um, I didn't want them to be on screens all day. My husband had popped out for an hour, and I was like, right, boys, time to get off your screens. go outside and entertain yourself outside. Obviously, they didn't want to do that. Who does? Gaming is so addictive. I get it. I don't judge them or shame them for that because it's designed by nature to be addictive. I absolutely get it. And I consider it my job as their parent to teach them healthy boundaries, especially on a gorgeous day. Let's get outside. And he pushed and he pushed and he pushed. And it got to in the end, I was like, right, if you don't get off your screens, there's going to be no, you will have no screens for a week. So I gave them that ultimatum. I said, I'm going to put my timer on for 1 minute. I'm going to come back and then it screens off. So I came back after a minute. I even done the old-fashioned counting down from 5 to 1, which I haven't had to do with them since they were toddlers. And my son still chose not to finish his game. We weren't, it wasn't aggression at this point. It was just like, no, I'm having so much fun. I just want to kill this, just kill one more person. It's just a, and so he carried on gaming only for about 4 or 5 seconds. It wasn't long, but he hadn't stopped by and I thought to myself, right, I'm not going to enforce anything now, but later he's going to not be able to have his screens because I said to him, if he didn't come off, there would be no screens. And I've always felt that, especially having boys, I knew, and they are now bigger than I am, I knew that I needed to enforce what I said I was going to do. So they knew ahead of time, if mum says something, that's what's going to happen. And so he, after a couple of seconds, he did come off his game. And actually, he came outside and he helped me in the garden, and we had a really gorgeous hour. He was digging some holes for me whilst I was planting some crocus bulbs, and we were having a laugh. And part of me was thinking, oh, this has been such a lovely afternoon. I now don't want to have to enforce a consequence for earlier. And he's starting to push the boundary. And he's starting to be disrespectful because one of the things that he said to me in that period was, "Oh, it's fine. I'm going to carry on playing. We'll wait for Dad to come home, then we'll get off." And I was like, "No, no, 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 no. This is not a dad a mum thing. If I've said something's going to happen, that's what's going to happen." So it was as the afternoon went on, I was then in my brain starting to think, "Oh no, now I don't want to enforce this consequence because it's kind of going to ruin our afternoon and we've had a really lovely time." So this was kind of going through my head, and it's not acceptable to be disrespectful. So when the time came and they were like, right, we can go back on screens, and I said to Blue, well, you can't, Blue, because you didn't come off earlier. And he sort of looked at me as if I was joking. And I was like, I'm not joking. I gave you a consequence that you chose not to get off your screen. So therefore you're choosing the consequence. There is no screens now, mate, for a week. He didn't like it at all, as I would expect. But what was interesting is his brain went to, that's really unfair. It was only 4 seconds. 4 seconds, it's not then fair to have a whole week of screens. So I had to make it very, and I get that. That would be a very unfair, unjust consequence, wouldn't it? If it was the 4 seconds. So there were a few things that I had to make sure that I did as the adult, because what tends to happen is when we're dealing with our teenagers or toddlers or any age, or actually any other human on this planet, what we judge them for being is what we become. So if you've when we don't quite understand where they're coming from and their logic, we then start to get defensive, arguing, and everything escalates. This didn't escalate because, fortunately, doing the work I did, I was able to check myself, and I was able to say to him, Blue, it's because I love you so deeply that I am not going to allow you to disrespect me. This has got nothing to do with the 4 minutes. This is everything to do with you pushing the boundary and thinking it's acceptable to ignore a request that I have made. So he by this point he was really frustrated, but because I wasn't frustrated, it didn't escalate. And so he was able to say to me, I just need some space. I just need some space. I was like, not a problem. When you're ready to talk about it more, we can talk about it more. But this is not the 4 seconds. This is the disrespect. And I gave him some space, and my husband got home and he got upset with my husband. And Johnny was like, well, don't hate the person giving the consequence, hate the consequence, but you can't go around disrespecting your mum. And if she gave you a choice, an ultimatum, and you chose to carry on playing, then you chose the ultimatum. So I'm incredibly fortunate that my husband backed me. And he did say to me, in his mind, he thinks it's the 4 seconds. So and that would be unfair, wouldn't it? So I gave him his space. I and I was then sort of carrying on doing my evening. But what was really fascinating, what I then observed in my head was, oh my gosh, this is going to ruin our relationship. He's going to hate me forever. Um, like it's never going to be the same again. My brain was really spinning out on the consequence of setting that um punishment isn't the right word, but the me setting that consequence, my brain was then going into this spiral. Oh, he's never going to love me again. And so I was able to just for an hour or so really watch my brain going to this worst case scenario and still choosing to teach my child respect. So it was what then happened is he sort of calmed down a little bit, and then he actually came out into the kitchen and he apologized, and we had this massive hug, and at that point both of us were crying because I said we had such a gorgeous afternoon, Blue. I don't want to ruin that, and it is just not acceptable to keep disrespecting me. But because then he was able to calm down and his logical brain is now kicking in because it starts their prefrontal cortex starts to develop at about the age of 11 and it can take up to 25. For those teenage years are interesting because 1 minute they're just completely irrational and then 1 minute they're totally rational. And so we were then able to have a conversation and I said to him, look, I get it if you're thinking that 4 seconds is the punishment, but this is not about those 4 seconds. This is about you pushing the boundaries and starting to disrespect me, and that's not acceptable. So I asked him, what do you think is fair? What do you think is a fair consequence? Because there has to be something. And so he said, well, I think maybe just the rest of today. I was like, okay, so let's compromise. No screens for the rest of today and all day tomorrow. And then you can go back to being on your screens. Do you think that's fairer? And he's like, yes. Okay, that's fine. So what we were able to do is able to get to that place where we did compromise and I was willing to see his point of view. He was willing to see my point of view. And we were able to have a much more effective conversation. Is he going to try and push the boundaries again? Probably yes. Will I enforce a consequence? Absolutely, should that happen. But that is my job as a parent. In my opinion, my job as a parent is not to be their best mate. It's to teach them how to be respectful, balanced adults. And as a woman, I believe it's my job to stand up and have that courageous conversation from a place of absolute love in order to teach my sons that women deserve respect. Women's opinions are to be listened to, they're not to be dismissed. But that starts with me. And when you come at it from a place of unconditional love, it is just a more efficient, effective conversation versus becoming the teenager myself. He doesn't respect me. You do this, you do that's unfair. I could have very easily have gone to that place, and trust me, part of my brain wanted to do that. But the absolute joy of learning how to manage your mind and manage your emotions is just the most valuable skill to learn and practice so that when these situations arise, which they will because we're growing humans, we can teach that love and respect and compromise. So I don't know how this is going to affect him going forward. But what I do know is that the whole process probably brought us closer together and created more of a connection than what would have happened had I have acted out of my childhood state and my primitive brain had been in charge and Sue would have been ranting and raving and doing all the things. And so I want to offer this to you. I want to offer to you that when you're dealing with any human, adult or child, just because they're in their emotional childhood state in that moment doesn't mean to say you have to be. This is especially true in the workplace. A lot of adults don't realize they have a choice as to how they behave. But having listened to this podcast episode, and if you listen to my other podcast episodes, you'll be starting to learn that you actually have a choice. How you show up in the world is a choice. And I'm not saying that the choice should be perfect all of the time. I'm not at all perfect all of the time. But even if we're 60% in control and deliberate, most of, 60% of the time, that's going to be so much more effective than continuing to act out of your primitive brain. So I haven't shared this story as a judgment, as a shoulding exercise towards you, as a look at me, aren't I perfect? That is not the situation because I am not perfect parent at all. But I do believe in the unconditional love and the way that I've said about approaching it before, and this can be really shocking, is I just imagine they don't come home tomorrow. I just imagine that in that moment, if Blue didn't come home from school, I would give anything for him to be stood in front of me, disrespecting me, trying to put something in the shopping basket that shouldn't be put in. That's unconditional love. And it sometimes sounds like no. It sometimes sounds like right. It's because I love you that because you're acting, choosing to act that way, this is now the consequence of that behavior. And you can't argue with that. You can't you can't escalate love. And if you escalate love, you just have more love. It's the most incredible thing. But it's a skill that takes practice. And if you want to learn that skill quicker, come and talk to me because this is what I do. I help people to learn how to manage their mind and manage their emotions so they get to show up in their life in the way that they want to show up. And I know that you fiercely love your children, fiercely love them. And it's because you fiercely love them that you might want to invest in this skill for yourself because it has an influence on them as well. Have the most incredible week. I hope this helps, and I'll speak to you all again next week. Bye bye.